Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, May 30th, 1921, the Tulsa neighborhood of Greenwood was thriving. Greenwood was often referred to as America's Black Wall Street, a neighborhood that was full of stable, Black-owned businesses and growing generational Black wealth. More than 70 businesses operated in Greenwood, mostly in 1- and 2-story buildings. Some of the names: the Earl Real Estate Company, the Little Rose Beauty Salon, the Dreamland Theater, the Alexander Hotel, doctors, lawyers, dentists, the Oklahoma Sun, one of 2 Black-owned newspapers in the neighborhood. But within a day, almost all of it would be gone. Over the course of 18 hours, starting on May 31st through June 1st, 1921, a white mob attacked residents, homes, and businesses in the Greenwood neighborhood. According to a later estimate, more than 1,200 houses were burned, 2 newspapers, a school, a library, a hospital, churches, hotels, stores, all destroyed or damaged by fire. Official records indicated 36 dead, but historians estimate the death toll may be as high as 300. What I am describing here is what has come to be known as the Tulsa Massacre or the Tulsa Race Riot or the Greenwood Riots. And this is, of course, 2021, the 100th anniversary of those riots. There is a considerable amount of coverage of those events, one of the most shameful and, until fairly recently, largely forgotten moments in U.S. history. So we're going to discuss the Tulsa riots, but we thought we'd focus, since a lot of the coverage is going to be focused on the riots themselves, and also because our episode is landing on the anniversary of the day before, we thought we'd focus a bit more on Black Wall Street and try and paint a picture of the last moments of this prosperous Black neighborhood. So here to do that are, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest is writer Cord Jefferson. I will say, if there's a TV show you've been blown away by over the last 5 years, there's a good chance Cord wrote for it. Succession, Master of None, The Good Place, one of my favorite writers, and also one of the lead writers on the HBO series Watchmen, which, if you've seen it, is set in Tulsa, and the opening scenes of the whole series are during the Tulsa Massacre. And as we will discuss, I think for many it vaulted those incidents into their consciousness and led to a lot of people learning about it for the first time. So Cord, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me. Out
of curiosity, Cord, do you say Tulsa Massacre, Greenwood Riots, Tulsa Race Riot? What do you say?
I say the Tulsa Massacre because, you know, as I learned it and also just how, as I see it, I think that riot sort of falls into the category of like both sidesism. I think riot suggests that responsibility lays at the feet of both parties. And so I sort of reject that. And I think history rejects that too. And so I sort of prefer and learn to prefer the Tulsa Massacre because I think that sort of like puts the blame at the feet of the people who deserve it, which is the white community in Tulsa that burned a thriving Black community and killed its residents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That community is, of course, the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa. As I said, Watchmen opens in this moment of the attack. But did you at all think about trying to paint a picture of what this community looked like and felt like prior to the attack? You know, what it felt like as a thriving Black community?
No, we wanted to do that. We actually wanted to do that in present day Greenwood. So the show is set in present day Greenwood, Oklahoma, and our intention was to show what that neighborhood could have liked in our sort of like alt history universe, where there was reparations given to the residents, to the ancestors of the people who'd been affected by the Greenwood massacre, where there had been a liberal president in office for 30 years that had sort of given all these benefits to victims of America's legacy of racism. So we wanted to show, a thriving Greenwood in present day. We wanted to show, Black Americans with thriving businesses and sort of and elegant homes and sort of the things that wealth affords, fancy cars, these kinds of things. And so we've sort of focused on what America might look like if it actually reckoned with its racist past and sort of and afforded people opportunity based on its racist past, rather than sort of focusing on what the neighborhood looked like prior to the massacre.
That really underscores those sites of wealth creation and why Greenwood was so important, right? Those first two things that you mentioned, businesses and homes. I mean, those aren't just signs of wealth, but they are continuous sources of wealth creation generationally. And that's what I think is so important about this story, is that you would need massive federal intervention to restore what was taken, because it wasn't just the loss of the things in that moment, but how that then reverberates across generations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime people talk to me about the Tulsa massacre, I always say, this wasn't a unique incident. Like you should go and sort of look at America's history, and you'll see that there's the Rosewood massacre and the Perry massacre and the Little Rock massacre. But to get to what you're talking about, Niki, I think the most a recent example here in California is Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, which was a Black beach resort in Manhattan Beach that I believe in the 1920s was taken from the Black family by eminent domain, because the Manhattan Beach government decided they didn't want Black people at the beach anymore, and so they took it from them. And the LA County Board of Supervisors, I think, just voted to restore Bruce's Beach back to the ancestors of the people it was taken from. And I think that the land is estimated, the value of the land is estimated like $75 million. So that, I mean, that was almost $100 million stolen from a Black family just because white people didn't want them on the beach anymore. So you're talking about massive amounts of wealth accumulation that Black people many Black people were not afforded because it was stolen from them at the turn of the century.
To me, what's remarkable about all of this is that, we're less than a century out of slavery at this point, maybe, 60, 80 years. I'm not good at math. But not long, 2-3 generations, let's just say. And to think of what has been acquired and accumulated in a relatively short amount of time from slavery, I mean, that to me is just, it's unimaginable to me how much Black people were able to accomplish for themselves and successfully for quite a long time before this massacre happened. So you think of, it's J.B. Stanford, who has his own luxury hotel with 55 rooms in it. You think of the fact that Black people own airplanes. 6 families own their own airplanes. Like, I think of, this is not just like, oh, we send our kids to school, we have a cute little house. Like, this is wealth that, people are owning airplanes in the 1920s. It's astounding. And I think it makes the aftermath of the massacre that more acute, because how much devastation occurred.
And just to underscore that, I mean, Greenwood was built to accumulate wealth, right? It was intentional. And part of it was just even like access to wealth, right? We're not going to get loans. We're not going to get small business loans from white banks, so we have to build our own banks in order to do it. But it was not, just this accidental accumulation. It was an intentional community, which is actually, when you hear that phrase, Black Wall Street, like I don't know how you feel about that. Sometimes I haven't been able to really square exactly how that comes off, but as a thing that lets you understand it as a site of not just like a nice neighborhood, but a site of wealth and generational wealth, I actually think like Black Wall Street helps that really land for me.
And a site of investment, as well. And I think that really underscores your point, is that, Kellie, you're talking about it as a deliberate creation and a deliberate investment. And that's so important because, you had an interesting mix of Black people there in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You had people who had been enslaved in Indian territory, but you also had people who were part of that early wave a little bit before the Great Migration and into the early days of the Great Migration, who are coming to Oklahoma, attracted in part by what is being built there. So that investment in that neighborhood helps to bring other Black investors, other Black families, other Black migrants into the town. And there's something very deliberate and special that is being created there.
That to me is one of the most devastating effects of it. I think that looking back at thinking about the generations of wealth that could have been accumulated with that as a foundation, thinking about what so many Black lives in 2021 might look like had the money not been stolen from their family 100 years ago, thinking about how different so many Black communities might be had they been allowed to flourish is, I think one of the most devastating things to think about when it comes to the massacre.
One of the things I appreciated about Watchmen and the ways that this moment was recreated was the way that they showed Black people resisting and fighting back. And I think that there's so much of discussion about this massacre where it erases the fact that Black people have attempted to stand up for themselves and arm themselves. And so as someone who studies violence, I'm always appreciative of being able to show Black people that are resisting and fighting back and being empowered.
We should say that the precipitating event was there was a young Black teenager named Dick Rowland, and he entered an elevator in an office building on Main Street in Tulsa. And at some point after that, the young white elevator operator, Sarah Page, screamed and ran away, as did Rowland. And there were rumors that he'd been arrested for sexually assaulting this woman. And so a white mob gathered outside the courthouse, and then a group of Black men came to the courthouse as well to defend him. And so tensions are just rising and rising and rising, as are rumors of a possible lynching. And then it is the next day that what we now have come to call the Tulsa Massacre begins, with mobs of white citizens descending upon Greenwood.
And it turned out that he had at most bumped into her or accidentally stepped on her foot.
Yeah. But the fact that 75 Black men show up armed to protect him because they know the lynch mob wants him, to me shows that this was not just like a relinquishing of, sure, we'll let you come in and take all of our community, that there were real attempts to fight back, but they were just overwhelmed. 75 men against 1,500 people is no fair fight.
75 men who were many of them trained as soldiers, like World War I veterans too. So that's something that I think that's something that we included in the show, is that we had our main character Will Reeves's father be a World War I veteran, and as many of them actually were.
Yeah, World War I is such an important backdrop for this story, because not only did it mean that there were all of these Black men who had military training, but who had, for those who went to Europe, the experience of being in a less segregated environment and had a taste of a different kind of freedom, and brought a kind of confidence that sprung from that experience back home. And that confidence was seen as such a threat to so many white Americans, and the efforts to stamp it out. You can see in this moment, right? If you have 75 armed Black men, if you have these veterans who are willing to fight for themselves, well, you have to snuff out the source of that power if you want to continue to maintain supremacy. And
also, something that I think about a lot when it comes to, every war that people of color fight in for this country, I just think that, I have to imagine, how furious I would be if I went and fought in the trenches for the United States of America and risked my life and saw my friends die, and then returned home and my fellow Americans were literally killing me and burning my neighborhood down and murdering my friends and neighbors and trying to murder me also. I have to imagine that, the devastation of just that realization that what did I go over there for if I'm returning home to this, which is another thing that we included in the show. We included in the show that, our version of actual leaflets, which were dropped on Black soldiers that said, "Why are you here, Negroes? What are you fighting for? This is not your war. This is not the country that respects you. Why are you fighting and dying for the United States?" Which the Germans really did drop flyers down on Black American soldiers at the time, stating that was the fact.
And that would happen again in World War II and in Vietnam, because it was the sore point in the U.S.'s claims that it was making the world safe for democracy and freedom and all of those things. So it was so easy to point to that that contradiction, that hypocrisy, and use it to undercut what the United States wanted its message to be.
This is a pretty naive question, but, Niki, you mentioned the sort of threat that a place like Greenwood posed. I'm wondering if you can articulate a little more, Cord, how you see that threat and why the white mob descended. I mean, I think of like the Wilmington Massacre, which was a direct response to political power, right? And I'm wondering if you can paint a picture of Tulsa and the dynamics as you see it and the different powers. Yeah,
I mean, I think Tulsa is similar to Wilmington. I think it's similar to Rosewood. It is. It's just this. Unfortunately, I feel like a very American idea that happiness and joy and wealth and power are a zero-sum game. And if your neighbor accumulates any of those, then it diminishes your capacity for those. That if your neighbor has some wealth and joy, then it diminishes your wealth and joy, particularly if your neighbor doesn't look like you, particularly if your neighbor is somebody that you've been told is inferior to you. And so all of a sudden it's like, if these people are inferior to me, why do they have all this stuff and I have none of this? That starts to eat away at these people, and I think it starts to eat away at a racist brain and starts to eat away at a racist heart and starts to make them angry. And I think that at that point it's just looking, you have a powder keg there and they're looking for any spark, any assault that they can misconstrue as sexual violence in order to give them some reason to storm the neighborhood and destroy it. I think that it's relatively simple calculations based on just, I think, human instinct and human emotion.
I also think that it's important to remember that these successful towns all across the country make themselves targets specifically because they debunk the myth of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. So the more successful you are, the more smart, the more land you own, the more money you make. All of these things undermine this idea that whiteness may not be so supreme. These are up and coming, rising, thriving places that cannot be in conversation with their white counterparts in any way. That's what's also most tragic, is that these towns are almost always the pride and joy of their community.
Cord, in terms of how you depicted this in Watchmen, and I'll just say, if you don't have an answer to this, we can not have an answer to this. You've mentioned already some of the tangible and interesting small details that paint the picture of this moment, and I feel like that's one of the strengths of the show. It is just full of so many little telling details. Are there any other parts of like recreating Greenwood in that moment or imagining it in the present day that you kind of have a soft spot for, like a little thing you did that maybe people didn't notice? Or
no, I don't think that there's anything. I mean, I will say that something that was important to us was there was no depictions of violence that weren't based on eyewitness accounts. Yeah. We knew that we didn't want people to be able to say, well, they're exaggerating this. This was made up. We sort of wanted to make sure that we stuck we hewed as closely to reality as possible in that moment. I think that in particular, the fire bombings from airplanes was something that people were like, oh, that's not real. They made that up. And in fact, like, no, there was many eyewitness accounts that there was firebombing from airplanes on Greenwood. So I think that sort of commitment to authenticity in a show that was otherwise kind of crazy at moments was important to us.
Can I ask a question? Was it true that it was prom night? I don't know that in the show, it's like the night of prom that this takes place. Was that an artistic flourish, or did that actually happen?
I don't know that's accurate. Is it in the show? I don't so.
Or maybe it's a school dance.
It's been a couple of years.
maybe it's a school dance, I don't. But I could have sworn, I was like, it's prom night? Oh my God, it's prom night? Like,
I don't recall it ever being prom night.
Okay, so maybe I'm reading into that, but I know that there's a dance.
Like any good art, you bring your own experience to it and you add your own levels.
A school dance, there's a social gathering, what have you. It happens. Something's happening.
It is striking. We recently talked about the Move bombing with Gene Demby, and there too, that bombs were dropped, and it would be interesting to sort of sketch a history of the times that the United States bombed itself and how often the target were people of color.
Or if ever they have dropped bombs on white citizens. I don't recall.
Seems like we would have heard of that. But
Yeah, totally would have heard of that. But it's interesting that in the instances that we do know about this have been, I mean, we talked about this with MOVE as well, have been marginalized or erased or forgotten. And so, or not covered well within the press to keep it in the public memory.
Yeah. That's a huge part of this story that I think is worth lingering on for a moment. It wasn't just that Greenwood was destroyed, but the incident itself, the violence itself, there was a very concerted effort to erase it from the historical record. When people went back to look at the newspapers, guess which issue was missing? The issue that told the story of this violence, that the police files were missing. There was a real effort to pretend it didn't even happen and to eliminate it from the historical record, which is why I think the work that's been done recently to bring it back to life has been so important.
Cord, was that something you were sort of consciously fighting against, knowing that it had been erased and that it needed work to bring back?
No, I mean, the credit to that falls with Damon Lindelof. He came into the show knowing that he wanted to set it in Tulsa and have the Tulsa Massacre be a big part of the show. We had no idea that we were going to open the pilot with that until we had been in the writer's room for several weeks. We thought that maybe we'd have a flashback to it and somewhere in the middle of the season, but ultimately, we decided to open the pilot with it, and after we made that decision, it was one of those things that was like, oh, this is so obvious. This needs to be the original sin of our show, and it's going to be the inciting incident for everything that takes place after it.
And as I hinted at in the opening, I do think for a lot of people, Watchmen was one of the ways in which they first heard about this incident. And I'm wondering, Cord, if you can talk a little bit about what it was like to see people learn about it, but also like, it's not a show. This is one of the strengths of the show. The show does not spoon feed you anything. And so there's part of me that's almost like, frankly, a little surprised that people connected the dots and went and did their own research, because they might be able to just say, oh, this is magical realism or this, whatever. And so, I'm curious if you were even maybe surprised that people took it to reality and did the research.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I was, that was one of the most gratifying things on the night of the premiere was that, Watchmen didn't really trend on Twitter, at least not where I saw it, but Tulsa trended on Twitter. The Tulsa Massacre was trending the night that it premiered, which to me was incredibly gratifying because it sort of, it made me realize that, we were helping educate, a generation of people who had never heard of this and didn't know this part of American history, this incredibly important part of American history. I remember somebody sent me a Google Trends graph that showed the spike overnight in people Googling the Tulsa Massacre just to sort of educate themselves about it. So, I think that I'm incredibly happy that people went and did their own research based on something that we just, we said, like, this was a part of history. It was the first 6 minutes of the episode. I'm happy people were intrigued enough to go look at it themselves. I don't want to pat ourselves on the back too much. I think that our show was part of a rising wave of people discussing Tulsa in popular culture. But, I think that if we had an effect at all, it makes me incredibly glad that we were able to do that. I would hope that America's public education system would be the one responsible with educating people about these kinds of things. But I guess in lieu of that, HBO will have to do for now.
I think a few years ago, I was a postdoc at Harvard, and one of my students was from Greenwood and talked about how some of those areas in Greenwood are still bordered up. It hasn't come back in the way that it once was, and that for people who in that area, they're very much aware of that history and of that trauma. But I think even among Black people, it's been very difficult to talk about this traumatic experience, even 2-3 generations removed. So the fact that it's coming up now and maybe we have enough distance to talk about it honestly, to me is encouraging.
And that's really, as we hit this 100th anniversary, I do hope that I suspect so much of the conversation is going to be about, those 2 days. Mm-hmm. And I really hope people look at the 2 decades before of wealth accumulation and the 10 decades since of loss of wealth accumulation and lingering trauma. That's the real story here, I think, as we've been discussing. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Cord Jefferson, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for doing all the wonderful work you do.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And now, as we wrap up, as I think you've heard, we are in the middle of the Radiotopia fundraiser. So I just want to very quickly say thank you to everyone who has given to the fundraiser. We are not able to make shows like this, have conversations like this without your support. I just want to acknowledge everyone who has supported the show in whatever way they can. And if now is the time for you to become a member of Radiotopia and support this show, please do so. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Abergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.